Well, thank you very much, Mandy. Greetings from a warm and sunny London. I'm sorry you live in such a cold climate here. It must be dreadful to have to put up with. There was a suggestion at one point that we might have done this outside, and I'm glad we've done it inside, apart from the fact that had we done it outside, I would have hoped that the pilot of a passing low-level drone might have seen my flight and learned something about his history that he didn't know already, but I don't think that's going to happen. I'll start with an apology. With so much going on around us that's of more immediate concern for Israelis and Palestinians, with daily lives lived in fear, homes destroyed, armies and militias doing what they do best, and the deafening sound of clashing narratives, it may seem of little relevance to talk about events which took place nearly 100 years ago. But nothing we can do today can erase those events from history, or make it as if they never happened. But as we know from the continuing Jewish efforts to ensure that the facts of the Holocaust are never forgotten, or indeed the importance to Serbian identity in the 14th century Battle of Kosovo, there's little more distressing or insulting than to have someone deny or ignore facts which underlie your identity, your ancestry, or even your legitimacy. And now I'm going to see if I can make this work. Right. These four white men with moustaches were instrumental in the issuing of several promises, either to or directly affecting the inhabitants of Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. These men are long dead, but the promises they made have affected, some would say blighted, the lives of millions of people in the Middle East. Without understanding how these promises came about, we can't really understand the roots of the conflict which we see around us today, and the deep-rooted nature of the principal grievance that Palestinians have against Zionists and Zionism, and against Israel for as long as it insists on being an exclusively Jewish state. There are three key promises made by Britain and its World War I allies, which presented in one form or another a view of what Palestinians could expect after the war. They're contained in the following documents in chronological order: the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence, discussing which areas of the Middle East would have their independence recognised by Britain after the war; the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which Britain and France agreed on which areas of influence each country would grant to the other in the post-war Arab world; and the Balfour Declaration, in which views were expressed about some kind of Jewish presence in Palestine after the war. Although these were secret agreements, they were only kept secret from the world at large. But the governments who approved the Sykes-Picot Agreement knew about the contents of the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence, and the government that accepted the Balfour Declaration knew of the contents of both of the previous two. So let's look at each in turn, starting with the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence. In July 1915, Sharif Hussein, ruler of Hijaz and religious leader of the Holy Muslim places, initiated a correspondence with the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Henry Mcmahon, to secure British support for the post-war independence of all the Arab countries of the Middle East then under Ottoman control. The outcome of the correspondence was that Britain guaranteed to recognise the independence of a whole swathe of the Arab world in return for Arab support for the British military efforts to defeat the Turks, who were allied with the Germans. The borders of the area of future independence which Hussein wanted clearly included Palestine. What Mcmahon did on behalf of the British government was to accept Hussein's map largely, but to exclude a few areas. What those areas were has been the subject of much discussion ever since, and I'll return to them in a moment. Subject to the above modifications, these are the exclusions that Mcmahon had laid out, Great Britain is prepared to recognise and support the independence of the Arabs within the territories in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sharif of Mecca. In other words, the area of Syria, Iraq, and Arabia, and so on. So the Arabs did their part by starting the Arab Revolt, fighting the Turks and keeping them and some Germans occupied until the Allied armies could join them and sweep through Palestine to Damascus. Both Lloyd George and Allenby went on record as saying that Arab help was essential. Since they'd fulfilled their part of the bargain, Hussein and his sons Faisal and Abdullah were entitled to believe that the Allies would respect the promises they gave in the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence. And in Hussein's view, these promises included independence for Palestine. The problem is, it wasn't long before Britain behaved as if Palestine wasn't included, and it continued to do so at various points over the next 20 years when it was expedient to do so. But the arguments for Palestine being included in the zone of independence are compelling. First, the easiest option if the British had intended to exclude it would have been to use the word Palestine. It was a recognised term and had been for hundreds of years to describe the southern area of Syria from the Lebanon down to Hebron and beyond. But instead, the Correspondence described the exemptions using geographical terms relating to areas on the borders of Turkey and a few towns in northern Syria, with nothing that specifically identified anywhere south of Damascus. This is the word, the text in the Correspondence, and that is a map that was attached to it. So what Mcmahon said the British excluded from the possibility of independence was the districts of Mersin and Alexandretta and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama and Aleppo. Now why did they pick those areas? We'll come in a moment to whether they picked Palestine. Why did they pick those areas? It's in the Correspondence itself, the reasons why, in the British view, certain areas should be excluded. But none of these reasons applied to Palestine at the time. And at no point do they say that Palestine should be excluded so that it can eventually be turned into a Jewish state. Here are the reasons that Mcmahon gave for saying. He said certain areas do not contain Arab inhabitants since they are on the edges of Turkey itself. So we're talking about Messina and Alexandretta. Certain areas, the second point, would be of special interest to France in any post-war settlement, and therefore their independence could not be recognised by the British. Well, the main claim that France was making, or was going to make, as we'll see in the next promise, was related to Syria. So, the exclusion of the non-Arab areas was accepted by Hussein, but even though no agreement with France had yet been signed, it was clear that the British, in exchange for interest in Palestine, would allow French interest in Syria. So if you read the whole Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence, you can see there's nothing that the ordinary reader could construe as excluding Palestine from the areas of the Middle East where the British government could support independence after the war. The most that has been tried, and there are books written on this, so I'm not going to go into detail, but there's been a lot of argument over the word districts, and there's been there was an Arabic translation of the Correspondence. The Correspondence was in English. Various people later on tried to imply that the district of Damascus was actually something which went all the way down to Jerusalem and so on. But the detailed analysis of the text shows that this is just, Britain trying to have its cake and eat it. But in any case, what did the British government itself believe? Here's what Mcmahon himself believed he was offering. In a secret telegram to the Foreign Secretary Edward Grey on the 26th of October 1915, I have been definite in stating that Great Britain will recognise the principle of Arab independence in purely Arab territory, this being the main point on which the agreement depends, but have been equally definite in excluding Messina, Alexandretta and those districts on the northern coast of Syria, which cannot be said to be purely Arab, and where I understand French interests have been recognised. Well, as you can see, there's Damascus, there's Homs, there's Hama, there's Aleppo, there's the northern coast of Syria, and there's Palestine, in green. So it's really difficult to sustain what the British tried to say at the time. However, 20 years later, after a lapse of time which can hardly be said to have improved his memory, Mcmahon said in a letter to the Times, "It was not intended by me in giving this pledge to King Hussein to include Palestine in the area to which Arab independence was promised. But all I can say is it might have been a good idea if he'd read his own correspondence before making a statement so at variance with the facts." Now we come to the second promise. This is just a reiteration of the point I made. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's interesting to see how the three promises I'm discussing, although involving commitments made in successive years, 1915, 1916 and 1917, were actually being discussed in overlapping time periods. While Mcmahon was making commitments to Hussein about Syria and Palestine, the British government was already having discussions with the French about carving up the Levant into spheres of influence. And this is why Mcmahon referred to the territories therein in which Great Britain is free to act without detriment to the interests of her ally France. At the time Mcmahon wrote this, no agreement had been made with France, and he was keeping his options open. When a secret agreement was actually signed between Britain and France, with Britain represented by Mark Sykes and France by François-Georges Picot in May 1916, it identified two areas, the red and the blue, to be controlled by France and Britain respectively after the war, and a third area, A and B, in which the two governments gave themselves various privileges of access and influence, and even administrative control in certain ways. But the A and B areas did not include Palestine. So when we're looking at the Sykes-Picot Agreement as it applies to Palestine, we can ignore the A and B areas and concentrate just on this yellow area, although apparently it also seems brown to some people, which was to be given a different treatment. This is all that Sykes-Picot says about Palestine. That in the brown area, yellow, there shall be established an international administration, the form of which is to be decided upon after consultation with Russia and subsequently in consultation with the other allies and the representatives of the Sharif of Mecca. So the only thing Sykes-Picot said about Palestine was that it would have an international administration in consultation with the allies and the representatives of the Sharif, which was obviously consistent with some measure of independence for the Arabs of Palestine. Okay, promise number 3, the Balfour Declaration. While the discussions that led to Mcmahon, Hussein and Sykes-Picot were unfolding, there were other eyes on post-war Palestine. A small group of British political Zionists set in motion a series of events which culminated in what was known as the Balfour Declaration. I'll read it in full. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, this again, like Hussein Mcmahon, or perhaps even more, has been the subject of endless and many books. And so I'm just going to concentrate on one or two aspects which strike me as worthy of noticing. For those of us who are familiar with the issues, the wording of this document has a rather feeble ring to it, compared with the importance it later assumed. The British government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. I might as well say I view with favour the establishment of a refuge for distressed donkeys in my village, and that I will use my best endeavours to support it, but I'm certainly not going to give my land for it or kick out tenants who live there already. It seems a bland sort of statement for the British government to make, if what it intended was the supplanting of the rights of almost the entire population of a Middle Eastern state in favour of a group of people who were largely European and who had no connection with the land other than a sentimental one. But of course that is not what it meant, in spite of all the, or what it means, in spite of all the efforts over the years to pretend that it does. The first issue to understand about the Balfour Declaration is who wrote it. It sort of triggers in my mind, one of those riddles, like who wrote the Balfour Declaration, which the obvious answer is the wrong one. It wasn't Balfour. The one thing we can say with a fair degree of certainty is that it was not a carefully considered binding document originated by and written by the British government. Here's what one member of the cabinet said about it. Remember, this is 1917 when they were discussing it, a decisive year in the war, and this is a man who was privy to all the discussions in cabinet. Members of the cabinet were overwhelmed with their several duties and with the general crisis of the time, when the Allies' fortunes were at a very low ebb indeed. There was a marked disposition for each minister to stick to his particular province and to accept the word of the others upon theirs. The Premier and Balfour tried to push the Zionist project briskly through, both of them possessed with an idée fixe. The terms of the declaration and its consequences had never been properly analysed by all members of the cabinet, and had certainly not been grasped by the non-partisan members after a fashion which would enable them to hold out against their pro-Zionist colleagues. So it was sort of steamrolled through the cabinet, I think. This was written by Edwin Montagu, himself a Jew, and in this case an anti-Zionist Jew. He fought a valiant battle to prevent the views of a group of Zionist Jews from having an influence on the British government. Because, of course, as is now well known, the Balfour Declaration originated with and was largely written by an unrepresentative group of British Jews led by Chaim Weizmann, whose ultimate aim, the sooner the better for them, was that Palestine, 90% Arab and 10% Jew as it was at the time, should be handed over to international Jewry. The only thing to be said in its favour about the official version of the Balfour Declaration is that it was a considerable improvement on some of the earlier drafts, largely because of the efforts of those civil servants and politicians who knew what a nonsense it was to the Zionists to claim that Palestine should be a Jewish state. That's why the early drafts were diluted, to make it the bland document it became. Not even a treaty, but just a letter from a politician to Lord Rothschild, actually written by Lord Rothschild, if you like, or by him and his colleagues. But here's a flavour of what the declaration might have been if the Zionists had had all their way. A group of leading Zionists, who called themselves the British Palestine Committee, met at the Imperial Hotel in Russell Square on July the 17th, 1917. You don't have to worry about whether you can read that. To draw up a statement to send to Lord Rothschild to pass on to his friends in government. This was the declaration they wanted. As you can see, handwritten on the paper. His Majesty's government accepts the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted, note the re, as the national home of the Jewish people. HMG will use its best efforts to secure the achievement of this object and will discuss the necessary methods and means with the Zionist organisation. It's interesting that even this draft is an advance on an earlier draft where the words national home have been substituted for Jewish state, which was in a draft that had been brought to the hotel that day. Although since Palestine was to become the national home of the Jews, it was clear what the Zionists wanted. This statement, drafted by Weizmann's young men, went through a number of drafts after being handed to the government to send back to them, to Weizmann. Try this, for example, a draft by Sir Philip Magnus, one of the many Jews who had a go at drafting a declaration like some sort of parlour game. At least his version was benign. It started, His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a centre of Jewish culture and will use its best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, and so on. What a different place the Middle East might have been if his version had been adopted. As we know, the Cabinet balked at going as far as the Zionists wanted in the wording, and in the Churchill White Paper of 1922, as the natives were becoming restless in Palestine, the government denied there was any intention for Palestine to become a Jewish state. The Churchill White Paper says unauthorized statements have been made to the effect that the purpose in view is to create a wholly Jewish Palestine. Phrases have been used such as that Palestine is to become as Jewish as England is English. His Majesty's government regard any such expectation as impracticable and have no such aim in view, nor have they at any time contemplated the disappearance or the subordination of the Arabic population, language or culture in Palestine. It's quite rich that this is in the Churchill White Paper, because Churchill himself made many strong Zionist statements in private around about that time, but clearly, the idea was getting around that the Balfour Declaration wasn't as bland as it seemed, and he needed to say something. In any case, an important point to make in the context of the time it was discussed, before, during, and after the negotiations that culminated in Mcmahon, Hussein and Sykes-Picot, is that unlike the other two promises, the Balfour Declaration did not have treaty status. Some commentators have suggested that Mcmahon-Hussein was not a treaty, but in 1919 Lloyd George said at a meeting of the Council of Four that the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence was a treaty obligation. But the Balfour Declaration was not a treaty because it was not an agreement between two parties to do one thing in exchange for another. Mcmahon agreed to recognize Arab independence in return for Hussein's help to defeat the Turks and the Germans. Britain recognized French claims in the Middle East in return for France recognizing hers. The Balfour Declaration was a one-sided statement with no obligation imposed upon the recipient, merely some information about something the government viewed with favour. Of course, the wording of the Balfour Declaration acquired more legal significance later, when it became incorporated into a more official document, as Zionist pressure on the British led to it being included in the British mandate, in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. But even here, interestingly, the words did not change to make them stronger. There was still the previous viewing with favour and talk of best endeavours, but nowhere, in spite of ensuing decades of Zionist claims, was there anything that said that the mandatory power was obliged to turn Palestine into a Jewish state, even though decade after decade this was the argument that the Zionists made to Britain. So there are the three promises that have bedeviled the history of the Middle East since they were made. How is one to reconcile them? Can they be reconciled? What ground rules should apply when understanding what was meant by each promise with reference to Palestine? But should the first promise override the later ones if they're in conflict? Or how about the last promise superseding earlier ones? It's wrong to say these promises cannot be reconciled. There's one interpretation of these three agreements that reconciles them absolutely. If we superimpose these promises into a Venn diagram, we'll see that the area of overlap is an independent Palestinian state. Mcmahon-Hussein does not exclude it. Sykes-Picot leaves it to an international administration in consultation with the Arabs. And Balfour views with favour a national home for the Jews, not a Jewish state, provided nothing is done to prejudice the rights of the inhabitants. I think this shows that if the Zionists had not insisted from the beginning on demanding the whole of Palestine, a state to which they had no legal claim, none of these promises would have ruled out a post-war settlement in which Palestine gained its independence and the Jews had a haven in the Holy Land, joining the existing Jewish communities in Palestine, with whom the majority Arab population has lived in reasonable harmony. This was certainly what many in Britain understood as the most desirable outcome, as was shown in a fourth promise that's not often discussed, but which is as binding and as revealing as the other three. This is known as the Anglo-French Declaration of 1918. By 1918, stop you reading. By 1918, doubts and suspicions had grown in the Arab world about what exactly the Allies, particularly Britain and France, were up to. Even the secret agreements had now been revealed after the Russian Revolution led to diplomatic documents being released by the Soviets. French activities in Syria and rumours of the Balfour Declaration, which had been followed by a semi-official Zionist delegation touring the country as if to size up its new possessions, made it essential to issue a clear statement of the Allies' policies for the liberated territories. So on November 17, 1918, the following proclamation was issued and given the widest possible publication in the Middle East. Unlike the Balfour Declaration, I should say, where the government banned it being published in the Middle East, until, of course, it leaked out, because I think the British government hadn't quite realised that there were some people in Palestine who could read English, and therefore would have seen it in the Times. So the Anglo-French Declaration said, France and Great Britain have agreed to encourage and to assist the establishment of native governments and administrations in Syria and in Mesopotamia, now liberated by the Allies, and in the territories whose liberation they seek, and to recognise them as soon as they are effectively established. Note, there is nothing about a Jewish state, just the establishment of national governments and administrations deriving their authority from the initiative and free choice of the native populations, which in Palestine can only have meant the combination of 90% Arab, 10% Jewish populations. There was one other part of the proclamation that both governments approved at the highest level, but was not published in Britain. It's always, I mean, sometimes when you're looking through papers, it's what is not said that is as significant as what is said. It was the preamble to this particular declaration, and the preamble removed any doubt about Palestine by saying that the declaration applied to the non-Turkish populations between the Taurus Mountains and the Persian Gulf. There's no wiggle room there. No one could say that Palestinians were not a non-Turkish population between the Taurus and the Persian Gulf. Once again, as with Mcmahon Hussein, there was something the Allies wanted, to quash unrest and counteract rumours. And to achieve this, they issued their fourth promise, and the one that contained perhaps the strongest guarantee that Palestine would get its independence. And Palestine is still waiting. Finally, it might be asked, why is it necessary to go through all these promises 100 years after they were made? There's one overwhelming reason, and it's this. Only one of them is still brought forward as a justification for what happened in Palestine, and in denial of the rights of the Palestinians, and that is the Balfour Declaration. In fact, it's worse than that. It's not the Balfour Declaration itself that's constantly parroted by supporters of Israel, but a narrow and erroneous interpretation of it to imply that Britain had always intended and actually promised that Britain would become a Jewish state. As we've seen, that's certainly what a group of political Zionists wanted it to say, but it never did. And later British governments made their views very clear. We've heard about the Churchill White Paper's comment on the idea of statehood. Here's what the British government said in May 1939. His Majesty's government declare unequivocally that it is not part of their policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. This was a public statement, not something said in secret. They should indeed regard it as contrary to their obligations to the Arabs under the mandate, as well as to the assurances which have been given to the Arab people in the past, like Mcmahon Hussein. Of all four documents, the Balfour Declaration is by far the most widely interpreted. It's time that the Balfour Declaration was recognised for what it actually said, not very much, and that two other promises, Mcmahon Hussein and the Anglo-French Declaration, were recognised as the binding commitment to ensure that Palestine was given its independence after World War I, with Sykes-Picot not inconsistent with that promise. None of this gives Palestine back to the Palestinians, but if just arguments ever come to play a part in the issue, rather than military might, there can be no doubt that history is on the side of the Palestinians. For 100 years they have suffered because of the incompetence, malice, ignorance and deceit of British statesmen. It should now be recognised that however long ago Britain promised the Palestinians an independent state, as we can see today that they did, it's time to deliver on that promise, however imperfectly, rather than cling to the feeble scrap of paper that was the Balfour Declaration. In fact, with the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration coming up, I suggest that the British government issues a new declaration on November the 2nd, 2017, with the following wording, and sends it to President Mahmoud Abbas, or whoever is sitting in his chair at the time. That's the old one, and this is the new one. Dear Mr. Abbas, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of Her Majesty's Government the following declaration of sympathy with Palestinian Arab aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Israel and Palestine of a national home for the Palestinian people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this effect, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Arab communities in Israel and Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Arabs in any other country. I would be grateful if you could bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Palestine National Council. Yours, Ed Miliband. Will it happen? Don't hold your breath. Thank you.